Long before the rise of Babylon's towering ziggurats and bustling markets, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, known to the Greeks as Mesopotamia, meaning, between the rivers, was already the beating heart of human civilization. This fertile crescent, stretching across modern-day Iraq, eastern Syria, and parts of Turkey and Iran, gave birth to the earliest cities, writing systems, and organized states. It is here that the story of Babylon begins, not as an isolated phenomenon, but as the culmination of millennia of human innovation, struggle, and ambition. By around 4000 BCE, the first urban settlements began to emerge in southern Mesopotamia, in a region known as Sumer. These early Sumerian cities, Uruk, Ur, Lagash, Eridu, and Nippur, were organized around temple complexes that dominated both spiritual and civic life. The ziggurat stood as the central institution, symbolizing the unity of religion, politics, and economy. Priests managed the distribution of food, land, and labor, while also interpreting the will of the gods through rituals and omens. This fusion of divine authority and administrative control would later deeply influence Babylonian governance. One of the Sumerians' greatest contributions was the invention of writing, cuneiform, around 3200 BCE. Initially used for keeping trade records and inventories, it evolved into a sophisticated script for literature, law, and science. The famous Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the world's oldest literary masterpieces, was first composed in Sumerian and later adapted into Akkadian, the language that would dominate Babylonian culture. Through cuneiform, knowledge could be preserved, transmitted, and standardized, laying the groundwork for Babylon's later intellectual traditions. Politically, Sumer was never a unified kingdom but a collection of city-states often engaged in rivalry and warfare. Each city had its own patron deity and ruler, known as the Ensi or Lugal. Over time, as competition intensified, leaders began to consolidate power beyond their city walls. This led to the emergence of the world's first empires, the most notable being the Akkadian Empire, founded by Sargon of Akkad around 2334 BCE. Sargon's conquests unified much of Mesopotamia under one rule, and his capital, Akkad, became a symbol of centralized authority and imperial ambition, a model that would inspire Babylon centuries later. The Akkadian Empire established Semitic language and culture as dominant forces in the region. Although it eventually fell around 2150 BCE due to invasions by the Gutians and internal instability, its legacy endured. The Akkadian language evolved into dialects, one of which, Babylonian Akkadian, would become the lingua franca of the ancient Near East for over 1,000 years. After the fall of Akkad, southern Mesopotamia entered a period of political fragmentation known as the Neo-Sumerian period, centered around the city of Ur. The third dynasty of Ur under kings like Ur-Nammu, who issued one of the earliest law codes, revived administrative sophistication and large-scale construction. However, by 2000 BCE, waves of Amorite tribes from the western deserts began to migrate into Mesopotamia, exploiting the weakness of local rulers. Among these Amorite settlements was a small but strategically located town, Babylon. At this time, Babylon was little more than an unremarkable city-state on the Euphrates River, overshadowed by the great powers of Isin, Larsa, and Nishnana. Yet its position at the crossroads of trade routes linking Sumer in the south with Akkad in the north would prove crucial. As political rivalries among older city-states intensified, Babylon's stability and accessibility made it an attractive center for commerce and migration. Gradually, it began to rise from obscurity. Thus, by the dawn of the second millennium BCE, Mesopotamia was a landscape of competing powers, fading Sumerian traditions, and emerging Semitic dynasties. Out of this mosaic of cultures, religions, and political experiments, Babylon would emerge, not as the first civilization, but as the heir to the world's earliest civilization, destined to carry its achievements to new heights. The stage was set for the city that would become synonymous with grandeur, intellect, and, ultimately, human hubris. Nestled along the slow, winding course of the Euphrates River, the city of Babylon began its existence as a modest settlement surrounded by fertile plains and ancient trade routes. Long before it became a symbol of imperial magnificence, Babylon was merely one of many small Amorite towns rising amid the ruins of older Sumerian civilizations. The exact origins of Babylon remain shrouded in mystery, for no archaeological layer clearly marks its foundation. Yet textual evidence and later chronicles suggest that by around 1894 BCE, it had become significant enough to be ruled by a local Amorite chief named Sumerian, marking the birth of what historians call the First Babylonian dynasty. The Amorites, a Semitic-speaking people from the west, had slowly infiltrated Mesopotamia during the centuries of political instability following the collapse of the Third Dynasty of Ur. Unlike the earlier Sumerian priest-kings, Amorite rulers combined tribal leadership with the urban administrative traditions they inherited. They adapted quickly to Mesopotamian customs, adopted the cuneiform script, and worshipped local deities, blending their nomadic heritage with the sophistication of settled city life. In this fusion of old and new lay the foundation for Babylon's distinctive culture, one that absorbed and reinterpreted everything it encountered. Geographically, Babylon enjoyed a position of strategic importance. Located roughly 85 kilometers south of modern-day Baghdad, it sat on the main waterway that linked the Persian Gulf to northern Mesopotamia. The river's seasonal flooding enriched the surrounding soil, ensuring abundant crops of barley and dates, while the city's position at the intersection of trade routes made it a vital commercial hub. Caravans from Syria and Anatolia brought timber, metals, and luxury goods. In return, Babylon exported grain, textiles, and crafts. This constant movement of people and goods fostered an early cosmopolitanism that would later define Babylon's character. Under its early Amorite rulers, Sumerian, Sumeriel, and Sabian, Babylon began to assert regional influence, though it remained overshadowed by stronger neighboring kingdoms like Larsa, Eshnunna, and Isin. The city's fortunes changed dramatically during the reign of Sin-Muballit, who consolidated control over surrounding territories and established Babylon as a modest but stable power. His son, Hammurabi, would later transform this emerging state into an empire, but the groundwork had already been laid by the generations who built the city's early walls, irrigation canals, and temples. Religion was central to Babylon's identity from the very beginning. The city's patron god, Marduk, was initially a minor deity associated with water and fertility. Over time, as Babylon's political power grew, so too did the prominence of Marduk. Early temple constructions, such as the Asagila, meaning House of the Raised Head, became focal points of devotion and civic pride. The belief that Marduk had chosen Babylon as his earthly dwelling lent divine legitimacy to its rulers, a concept that would later be woven into imperial ideology. This close intertwining of religion and politics helped Babylon project an image of sacred destiny that inspired both loyalty and reverence among its inhabitants. Culturally, early Babylon drew deeply from Sumerian and Akkadian traditions. Administrative documents written in Akkadian cuneiform reveal a sophisticated bureaucracy concerned with taxation, irrigation, and labor management. Clay tablets record transactions, temple offerings, and even school exercises, showing that literacy and scholarship were already valued. Babylonian scribes, trained in temple schools, copied and preserved older Sumerian texts, ensuring that the intellectual achievements of earlier civilizations were not lost but reinterpreted through a new linguistic and cultural lens. Architecturally, the young city was modest compared to its later grandeur, but it already displayed the distinctive features of Mesopotamian urban planning. Houses of sun-dried brick lined narrow winding streets, while public spaces centered around temples and administrative buildings. Defensive walls began to rise, more symbolic than militarily effective at first, yet signaling the community's growing ambition to endure. Water channels and levees reflected an advanced understanding of hydraulic engineering, vital for controlling the unpredictable floods of the Euphrates. By the dawn of the 18th century BCE, Babylon had become a small but dynamic city-state, prosperous, pious, and poised for expansion. It was no longer merely one settlement among many but a rising force in central Mesopotamia. The combination of strong leadership, favorable geography, and cultural adaptability had turned what was once a tribal outpost into a structured kingdom. Still, its true glory lay ahead. In the next generation, under the leadership of Hammurabi, Babylon would not only dominate Mesopotamia politically but also define its civilization intellectually and legally for centuries to come. The seed of empire had been planted, and soon it would bloom into one of the most remarkable powers of the ancient world. Before Babylon ascended to glory, it inherited the wisdom, institutions, and traditions of two great civilizations that had shaped Mesopotamia for over 1,000 years, the Sumerians and the Akkadians. The foundations they laid in politics, law, religion, architecture, and literature became the bedrock upon which Babylonian culture would stand. In many ways, the Babylonian Empire was not an isolated creation but the culmination of centuries of cultural evolution that began in the city-states of southern Mesopotamia. The Sumerians, who flourished between roughly 3,500 and 2000 BCE, were pioneers in nearly every aspect of urban civilization. They introduced organized agriculture through advanced irrigation systems, transforming the arid plains between the Tigris and Euphrates into fertile farmland. Their invention of cuneiform writing revolutionized communication, enabling the recording of trade, administration, myths, and laws. The Sumerians also established a pantheon of gods that reflected the forces of nature, Anu the sky god, Enlil the god of air, and Inanna the goddess of love and war. These deities, their myths, and their rituals would later be absorbed, reinterpreted, and continued by the Babylonians, who particularly elevated Marduk, a later synthesis of earlier divine archetypes. Politically, Sumer was divided into independent city-states such as Ur, Uruk, Lagash, and Eridu. Each was ruled by a Lugal, meaning a great man or king, who combined both religious and administrative authority. The temple, or ziggurat, stood at the center of each city as both a religious sanctuary and an economic hub. The Sumerians understood governance not merely as political control but as a sacred duty to maintain cosmic order, a belief that would profoundly influence Babylonian kingship. When Babylon's rulers later declared themselves the chosen of Marduk, they were echoing this ancient concept of divine legitimacy. The fall of Sumerian power around 2000 BCE did not end their cultural dominance. Their successors, the Akkadians, emerged in northern Mesopotamia, bringing with them the first unified empire in history. Under Sargon of Akkad, during 2334 to 2279 BCE, the Akkadians conquered vast territories, from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. Sargon established a centralized administration, standardized taxation, and built an imperial army and institutions that later Babylonian rulers would emulate on a grander scale. The Akkadian Empire also facilitated linguistic and cultural fusion. The Sumerian language remained the language of scholarship and religion, while Akkadian became the language of government and daily life. Under the Akkadians, Mesopotamia witnessed remarkable literary and intellectual flourishing. Texts such as the Epic of Gilgamesh, originally Sumerian, were translated and expanded into Akkadian, preserving the mythological heritage that would later inspire Babylonian theology. Astronomical records, omen texts, and hymns show that early Mesopotamian thought was already blending observation with spiritual interpretation, a tendency that would reach new heights in Babylonian science and astrology. The Akkadians also introduced new artistic conventions, royal reliefs depicting the king as a divinely chosen warrior and city walls adorned with scenes of conquest and ritual. These artistic ideals of divine kingship and monumental architecture would later manifest in Babylon's palaces and temples. The collapse of the Akkadian Empire around 2150 BCE, likely caused by internal strife, climate change, and invasions by the Gutians, led to a period of fragmentation. Yet the cultural synthesis it created endured. When the Third Dynasty of Ur briefly revived Sumerian political dominance, it did so within the administrative framework and language introduced by the Akkadians. This pattern, the preservation and adaptation of earlier traditions, became characteristic of Mesopotamian civilization and, ultimately, of Babylon itself. By the time the Amorites settled in central Mesopotamia and founded Babylon, the city inherited not a vacuum but a living legacy. The Babylonian scribes studied Sumerian grammar and literature as classical education. The city's legal and administrative systems echoed Sumerian codes and Akkadian bureaucracy. Even its architecture and temple rituals reflected a continuity of sacred tradition. Babylon thus emerged not merely as a new power but as the heir and guardian of an unbroken cultural lineage stretching back to the dawn of civilization. In this way, Babylon's greatness lay not only in conquest or wealth but in preservation, in taking the scattered fragments of Sumer and Akkad and uniting them into a coherent civilization. The city's intellectual and spiritual achievements would later influence the entire Near East, from Assyria to Persia and beyond. As Babylon prepared to step onto the stage of history, it carried with it the accumulated knowledge of 2 millennia. The river of Mesopotamian civilization had many tributaries, but they all flowed into Babylon. The emergence of Babylon as a dominant force in Mesopotamia cannot be understood without examining the rise of the Amorites, a Semitic-speaking people who migrated into the fertile lands of the Tigris and Euphrates valleys during the early 2nd millennium BCE. To many of the settled Sumerians and Akkadians, these Amorites were seen as outsiders, tribal wanderers from the western deserts of Syria and Canaan. Yet within a few generations, they not only adapted to Mesopotamian civilization but also reshaped it. The Amorites infused new energy into the political and cultural landscape, and among their new city-states, Babylon would rise as the brightest star. The Amorite migrations occurred gradually, beginning around 2100 BCE, during a time of weakened central authority in Mesopotamia. The collapse of the Third Dynasty of Ur had left the region divided into small competing kingdoms such as Isin, Larsa, Eshnunna, and Mari. These Amorite groups, once viewed as semi-nomadic herders, began to settle in these cities, often taking positions as soldiers, laborers, or local rulers. Over time, their leaders established dynasties that merged Amorite tribal traditions with Mesopotamian urban governance. It was within this social and political transformation that Babylon, a small and previously insignificant town, gained its first Amorite ruler, Sumuabum, around 1894 BCE. Sumuabum's reign marks the beginning of the First Babylonian dynasty. Although little is known about his early rule, inscriptions suggest he was an independent king who defended his city against larger neighbors such as Kazallu and Larsa. His successor, Sumuliel, continued this consolidation, fortifying the city's defenses and extending its influence along the Euphrates. These early kings laid the administrative and military foundations that later allowed Hammurabi to expand Babylon into an empire. At this stage, Babylon was still a small regional state, but it was increasingly recognized as a stable and well-governed power amid the political turbulence of Mesopotamia. The Amorites brought with them a distinct social organization based on tribal loyalty and kinship, which they successfully blended with the bureaucratic systems inherited from the Sumerians and Akkadians. This blending of old and new, rural vigor with urban order, proved to be one of the keys to Babylon's future success. The stage was now set for the arrival of Babylon's most renowned ruler, Hammurabi, who would take the legacy of these early Amorite kings and turn their modest city-state into an empire. Through conquest, law, and cultural unification, he would elevate Babylon to a level of power and prestige that no Mesopotamian city had achieved before. The rise of Hammurabi marked the beginning of Babylon's first golden age, a period when the city became the undisputed heart of Mesopotamia and the symbol of civilization itself. Few names in ancient history shine as brightly as Hammurabi, the sixth king of the first Babylonian dynasty. His reign, from 1792 to 1750 BCE, transformed Babylon from a modest Amorite city-state into the dominant empire of Mesopotamia. Under his rule, Babylon became not only a political and military powerhouse but also the cradle of legal and administrative sophistication. Hammurabi's achievements in governance, diplomacy, and infrastructure established a model of centralized rule that would influence civilizations for millennia. When Hammurabi ascended the throne, Babylon was surrounded by powerful and rival states. To the south lay Larsa, ruled by the ambitious Rimsin I, to the east, the Elamites threatened from the Iranian plateau, and to the north and west stood Ashnuna, Mari, and Assyria, all competing for control of trade and territory. Hammurabi's early reign was cautious. He spent his first decades consolidating Babylon's defenses, improving irrigation, and strengthening alliances through diplomacy rather than immediate conquest. His ability to balance patience with strategic timing would prove crucial to his later success. One of Hammurabi's earliest priorities was to secure Babylon's agricultural base. Mesopotamia's prosperity depended entirely on the careful management of its waterways. Hammurabi invested heavily in repairing canals and constructing new ones, ensuring consistent irrigation for crops and reducing the threat of devastating floods. Administrative records from his reign show that he personally oversaw the allocation of water rights and labor for maintaining canals, an indication of how closely the king was involved in economic management. This attention to infrastructure not only boosted agricultural productivity but also reinforced loyalty among local communities. As Hammurabi's authority grew, he began a series of calculated military campaigns. Between 1765 and 1761 BCE, he defeated Larsa, ending its dominance in southern Mesopotamia and uniting the region under Babylonian control. He then turned his attention northward, subduing Ashnuna, Mari, and Assyria. His campaign against Mari, in particular, was significant. Its archives, discovered thousands of years later, reveal correspondence between Hammurabi and other rulers that illuminate his diplomatic skill. By 1755 BCE, Hammurabi had effectively unified all of Mesopotamia, from the Persian Gulf to the borders of Syria, creating one of the earliest centralized empires in world history. However, Hammurabi's fame rests not only on conquest but on his code of laws, one of the most important legal documents ever created. The Code of Hammurabi, inscribed on a tall basalt stele and displayed in public, consisted of 282 laws covering topics such as trade, property, marriage, slavery, and criminal justice. The preface proclaimed Hammurabi as the shepherd chosen by the gods, to bring justice and order. The laws themselves reveal a complex society deeply concerned with fairness, accountability, and social hierarchy. Although punishments often reflected the principle of lex talionis, an eye for an eye, the code also introduced legal protections for the weak, including widows, children, and debtors. It established standardized rules that curtailed arbitrary decisions, setting a precedent for later civilizations. Culturally, Hammurabi's Babylon became a hub of scholarship, religion, and art. Temples dedicated to Marduk and other deities flourished, and scribal schools produced vast archives of administrative and literary texts. The king's patronage encouraged the preservation of Sumerian and Akkadian literature, ensuring that the intellectual heritage of earlier ages endured. Babylonian society during his reign was highly organized. Agriculture, crafts, and trade were regulated through state oversight, while scribes meticulously recorded transactions and taxes on clay tablets. Hammurabi's government exemplified a balance between divine authority and bureaucratic precision. Despite his achievements, the unity Hammurabi created proved fragile. After his death in 1750 BCE, his successors struggled to maintain control over the vast territories he had conquered. The centralized system he built depended heavily on his personal leadership and charisma. Within a few decades, rival powers began to reassert themselves, and Babylon's empire gradually fragmented. Yet Hammurabi's legacy endured in law, administration, and ideology. His vision of a just and ordered society governed by written law would influence Assyria, Persia, and even the legal traditions of the modern world. By the end of his reign, Babylon stood as the undisputed heart of Mesopotamia, a city of wealth, learning, and divine authority. The Amorite dream had reached its zenith, and Hammurabi's Babylon had become a symbol of civilization itself. Though the empire would soon decline, the memory of Hammurabi's rule would echo across the centuries, enshrining him as the first great lawgiver in human history. The Code of Hammurabi remains one of the most remarkable achievements of ancient Mesopotamia, not merely as a collection of laws, but as a window into the social, economic, and moral values of early civilization. Created around 1754 BCE, it stands as one of the earliest and most complete written legal codes in human history. More than a political instrument, it was a declaration that justice and order must govern society, a principle that would echo through countless generations. The code itself was engraved upon a tall diorite stele, standing over 7 feet high. At its top, an intricately carved relief depicts Hammurabi standing before Shamash, the Babylonian god of justice. The god extends to him a rod and ring, symbols of authority, signifying that Hammurabi's right to rule and legislate derived from divine approval. This visual message was clear to every viewer: law was sacred, and the king was its earthly guardian. Beneath this image, 282 laws were inscribed in Akkadian cuneiform, arranged in a long, continuous column. The stele was placed in a public space, likely near a temple, where citizens could see it, a symbolic gesture of transparency and fairness. The laws themselves cover nearly every aspect of daily life in Babylon. They deal with commerce, property, family relations, agriculture, labor, contracts, and criminal justice. The guiding philosophy was to maintain social order by assigning specific punishments for specific crimes. Many punishments were based on the principle of retaliation, known as lex talionis, an eye for an eye. For example, if a builder's negligence caused a house to collapse and kill its owner, the builder would be executed. If it killed the owner's son, then the builder's son would die. Harsh as these measures seem today, they were meant to ensure responsibility and deter recklessness. However, the code also recognized social distinctions. Babylonian society was hierarchical, divided into 3 main classes: Awilu means free men, Mushkanu means dependents or commoners, and Wardu means slaves. Punishments and fines varied depending on the class of both the victim and the offender. A noble who injured another noble faced a more severe penalty than if he injured a commoner. Yet even within this rigid framework, Hammurabi's laws represented progress. They protected the weak from abuse, provided women with certain rights in marriage and property, and regulated slavery to prevent excessive cruelty. In economic matters, the code sought to stabilize society through fairness and predictability. It set fixed wages for laborers, fees for doctors, and interest rates for loans. Merchants were required to provide written contracts, and landowners were held accountable for maintaining irrigation canals, a vital duty in a land dependent on the Euphrates. By codifying such regulations, Hammurabi ensured that economic disputes could be resolved according to law rather than personal power or arbitrary judgment. In this sense, his code served as a cornerstone of bureaucratic governance. Perhaps most importantly, the code articulated a moral vision of kingship. In the prologue, Hammurabi describes himself as a ruler chosen by the gods to bring peace, justice, and prosperity to the land. He boasts of destroying the wicked and the evil, that the strong might not oppress the weak. This declaration was both political and ideological, reinforcing the image of the king as the protector of divine justice. The laws were thus more than practical rules, they were a reflection of Babylon's belief that order came from the harmonious cooperation between divine will and royal authority. The legacy of Hammurabi's code extends far beyond ancient Babylon. Though the empire that produced it eventually faded, the principle of written, public law endured. Centuries later, the Assyrians and Persians adopted similar systems of codified governance. Even in modern times, Hammurabi's influence can be traced in the foundations of Western legal thought, in the concept that laws must be clear, consistent, and applicable to all citizens. When the stele was rediscovered in 1901 by French archaeologists at Susa in modern Iran, it reignited global fascination with Babylon's achievements. The text revealed a civilization of remarkable complexity, one that valued justice, accountability, and social order. The Code of Hammurabi remains not only a testament to Babylon's administrative genius but also a symbol of humanity's enduring quest to balance power with fairness. The death of Hammurabi in 1750 BCE marked the beginning of a slow but steady decline for the First Babylonian dynasty. His reign had unified Mesopotamia under one strong central authority, but that unity depended largely on his personal leadership, political skill, and military prestige. Without his firm hand to maintain order, the empire began to fracture. His successors inherited a vast, complex realm, yet they lacked the vision and strength to govern it effectively. The result was a century of gradual disintegration that weakened Babylon and left it vulnerable to foreign invasion. Hammurabi's immediate successor, Samsu-Iluna, faced immense challenges from the very beginning. Revolts erupted across the empire, especially in Sumer and Akkad, where regional governors sought independence. The southern cities of Uruk, and Isin, once proud centers of Sumerian civilization, rebelled against Babylonian rule. Samsu-Iluna managed to suppress these uprisings temporarily, but at great cost. Many of these ancient cities were destroyed, their populations displaced. This devastation further eroded Babylon's economic base and cultural heritage. To make matters worse, external threats began to emerge. The Kassites, a mountain people from the Zagros region to the east, started to move into Mesopotamia. Although they initially served as mercenaries or traders, over time their influence grew. Meanwhile, Elam, Babylon's long-standing rival to the southeast, regained strength and posed a persistent military threat. The combination of internal rebellion and external pressure pushed Babylon into a prolonged period of instability. Economically, the empire was also under strain. Hammurabi's centralized system of taxation and irrigation management required efficient administration, but his successors struggled to maintain it. Records from the period showed declining agricultural productivity and disrupted trade routes. The once thriving network that connected Babylon to Mari, Eshnunna, and beyond, began to collapse as regional autonomy increased. With diminished revenue, the government could no longer fund public works or maintain a standing army of the same size and discipline that Hammurabi had commanded. Culturally, the later rulers tried to preserve the image of divine kingship that Hammurabi had established, but the moral authority of the monarchy weakened. Inscriptions from the time suggest that the people of Babylon began to question the gods' favor. Floods, famine, and political instability were interpreted as signs of divine displeasure. The great temples of Marduk and other deities remained active, but their wealth was often redirected to fund military campaigns rather than religious ceremonies. Babylonian scribes continued their work, copying older texts and preserving knowledge, but fewer new literary or legal innovations appeared. The creative energy that had characterized Hammurabi's age was fading. By the mid-18th century BCE, Babylon had lost most of its territorial empire. The north was seized by Assyria, which began to emerge as an independent kingdom centered on the city of Ashur. In the west, the territories along the Euphrates drifted away, forming small regional powers. The south, devastated by earlier conflicts, was sparsely populated and economically stagnant. Babylon remained a city of importance, but its days as the uncontested capital of Mesopotamia were over. The final blow to the first Babylonian dynasty came from the Hittites, a powerful Indo-European people from Anatolia. Around 1595 BCE, under their king Mursalai I, the Hittite army marched unexpectedly into Mesopotamia. They penetrated deep into Babylonian territory, sacked the city of Babylon itself, and carried off its treasures, including the statue of Marduk, the city's chief god. Although the Hittites quickly withdrew, their invasion left Babylon defenseless. In the power vacuum that followed, the Kassites took control, marking the beginning of a new era. Thus ended the first Babylonian dynasty, which had begun with the Amorites' rise to power and reached its height under Hammurabi. Its collapse reflected the challenges of maintaining a centralized empire in a region of diverse peoples and constant rivalries. Yet even in decline, Babylon remained a symbol of civilization, a city of enduring influence whose cultural and legal legacy would survive under new rulers. After the fall of the first Babylonian dynasty, Babylon entered a period of chaos. The once mighty city lay weakened, its population scattered, and its political authority shattered. Into this vacuum stepped the Kassites, a people of uncertain origin who came from the Zagros Mountains, east of Mesopotamia. At first, they were outsiders, semi-nomadic highlanders who had occasionally served as mercenaries in Mesopotamian armies. Yet over time, the Kassites proved to be both pragmatic and adaptable. By around 1590 BCE, they had seized control of Babylon and founded a new dynasty that would last for over 4 centuries, one of the longest in Mesopotamian history. The Kassite period marked a new phase in Babylon's story, not one of conquest and empire, but of stability, reconstruction, and cultural continuity. Instead of attempting to recreate Hammurabi's vast territorial empire, the Kassite kings focused on restoring internal order and rebuilding the economy. They understood that Babylon's strength lay in its role as a religious, cultural, and administrative center rather than as a military power. One of their first acts was to restore the temples and re-establish the cult of Marduk, Babylon's chief deity. The statue of Marduk, which the Hittites had taken during their invasion, was eventually recovered and returned to the city, a symbolic victory that legitimized Kassite rule. By honoring Babylon's gods and preserving its traditions, the Kassites earned the loyalty of the local priesthood and the population. This religious diplomacy proved more effective than military force in uniting a diverse society. Administratively, the Kassites brought innovation. They reorganized the country into provinces governed by local officials known as Saknu, who reported directly to the king. They also introduced a system of land grants, known as Kaduru stones, inscribed boundary markers that recorded royal donations of land to soldiers, nobles, or temples. These stones, carved with both legal inscriptions and religious symbols, are among the most important artifacts of the period. They demonstrate how the Kassites combined legal order with divine sanction, ensuring loyalty while promoting agricultural development. The Kuduruz system strengthened Babylon's agrarian economy and established a class of landholding elites loyal to the crown. Economically, the Kassite rulers restored the irrigation networks and reopened trade routes that had been disrupted after Hammurabi's successors. Babylon once again became a hub of commerce, linking Mesopotamia with Elam, Assyria, Anatolia, and the Persian Gulf. The export of grain, dates, and textiles flourished, while imported goods such as tin, copper, and luxury items flowed into the city. Babylon's wealth grew steadily, but unlike Hammurabi's empire, it was now based on economic integration and diplomacy, not on conquest. Culturally, the Kassite period was one of remarkable preservation and synthesis. The Kassites themselves gradually assimilated into Babylonian society, adopting the Akkadian language and venerating Mesopotamian gods. Rather than imposing their own traditions, they became custodians of Babylon's ancient heritage. Temples, ziggurats, and palaces were rebuilt in the Mesopotamian style, and scribes continued to copy Sumerian and Akkadian texts. The city of Nippur, sacred to the god Enlil, regained prominence as a major religious center. The Kassites understood that to rule Babylon meant to become Babylonian, and this cultural adaptation ensured their longevity. Relations with neighboring states during this era were relatively peaceful. Babylon maintained diplomatic correspondence with Egypt during the reigns of King Amenhotep III and King Akhenaten, as recorded in the famous Amarna letters. These clay tablets, written in Akkadian, the international language of diplomacy, reveal that Babylonian kings exchanged gifts and marriage alliances with the pharaohs. Babylon was thus part of a wider network of great powers that included Egypt, Mitanni, and the Hittites. This age of diplomacy, often called the International Bronze Age, allowed Babylon to prosper without the constant warfare that had plagued earlier centuries. Despite this stability, the Kassite dynasty was not immune to decline. Over time, internal weaknesses appeared, local governors gained autonomy, and Assyria, to the north, grew increasingly powerful. By the 12th century BCE, invasions from the Elamites and later the Arameans began to threaten Babylon's security. Yet for over 400 years, the Kassites had provided peace and continuity, transforming Babylon from a conquered city into a thriving cultural beacon once again. In the grand timeline of Mesopotamian history, the Kassite dynasty stands out as an era of recovery, preservation, and endurance. It was not an age of empire building or monumental conquest, but of quiet reconstruction, the steady work of rebuilding civilization after chaos. Under the Kassites, Babylon re-emerged as the spiritual heart of Mesopotamia, a role it would maintain long after their dynasty faded into memory. While Babylon enjoyed stability under the Kassite dynasty, a new power was quietly rising in the north, Assyria. Centered on the city of Ashur, along the middle Tigris River, Assyria evolved from a small trading state into one of the most formidable empires of the ancient world. Its emergence in the second millennium BCE gradually transformed the political landscape of Mesopotamia. For centuries, Babylon and Assyria would coexist uneasily, sometimes as allies, often as rivals, competing for supremacy over the Fertile Crescent. The early Assyrians were originally merchants rather than conquerors. During the Old Assyrian period, around 1900 to 1700 BCE, they established trading colonies in Anatolia, notably at Kanish. Their wealth came from commerce in tin, textiles, and silver. However, by the 14th century BCE, under kings such as Ashur-uballit I, Assyria began to transform into a territorial kingdom. The weakness of surrounding states, including Babylon under the later Kassites, allowed Assyria to expand its influence. Ashur-uballit declared himself king of Assyria, breaking free from Babylonian overlordship and asserting independence. This shift marked the beginning of the Middle Assyrian period, during which Assyria would rise to challenge Babylon's supremacy. Assyria's strength lay in its military organization and centralized administration. Its kings built a disciplined army capable of swift campaigns, supported by advanced iron weaponry and chariotry. Assyrian rulers such as Adad-nirari I and Shalmaneser I expanded their domains through relentless conquest, capturing key cities and imposing tribute on their neighbors. These kings also saw themselves as agents of divine justice, chosen by their god, Ashur, to rule the world. In their royal inscriptions, war was not merely politics, it was a sacred duty. This ideological foundation gave the Assyrian state a sense of purpose and unity that few could match. For Babylon, the rise of such a powerful northern neighbor was both an opportunity and a threat. The Kassite kings sought to maintain peaceful relations through diplomacy and intermarriage, as reflected in correspondence found in the Amarna letters. However, the balance of power was fragile. Under Kashtiliash IV, tensions erupted into open conflict. The Assyrian king Tukulti-Ninurta I, one of the most ambitious rulers of his age, invaded Babylon, captured the city, and carried off the statue of Marduk, just as the Hittites had done centuries earlier. This event deeply humiliated the Babylonians, for the theft of Marduk's image symbolized the loss of divine favor and national identity. Tukulti-Ninurta's conquest, however, was short-lived. His harsh treatment of Babylon sparked rebellion, and after his death, Assyria withdrew, leaving chaos behind. Yet the invasion had lasting consequences. It marked the end of the Kassite dynasty, which soon collapsed under combined pressure from Assyria, Elam, and internal dissent. Babylon entered a period of political fragmentation, while Assyria continued to strengthen its administrative and military systems. Culturally, the relationship between Babylon and Assyria was complex. Despite political rivalry, the Assyrians revered Babylon as the spiritual center of Mesopotamian civilization. Babylonian priests, scribes, and architects were often invited to the Assyrian court, and Assyrian kings studied Babylonian literature and science. The Babylonian language remained the lingua franca of diplomacy and scholarship throughout the region. Thus, while Assyria grew in military power, Babylon retained cultural prestige, a city of sacred knowledge and ancient wisdom. During the 12th century BCE, as Assyria expanded westward into Syria and Anatolia, both powers faced new challenges from migrating tribes, including the Arameans and the Chaldeans. These groups would later play decisive roles in Babylon's fate. The Kassite kingdom had vanished, but Babylon itself endured, resilient as ever. By the end of the Middle Assyrian period, Assyria had emerged as the dominant force in northern Mesopotamia, while Babylon's power waned in the south. Yet history was not finished with Babylon. Though eclipsed politically, the city's name still carried immense weight. In time, new rulers, including the Chaldeans, would revive its glory and challenge Assyria once more for control of the ancient world. Following the fall of the Kassite dynasty in the 12th century BCE, Babylon entered one of the most turbulent and uncertain periods in its long history. Historians often refer to this era as the Babylonian Dark Age, lasting roughly from 1150 to 900 BCE. It was a time marked by invasions, political fragmentation, and economic decline. Yet, despite the apparent collapse of centralized authority, Babylon's cultural identity and religious prestige endured, allowing the city to survive until its eventual revival centuries later. The downfall of the Kassites created a power vacuum that was quickly exploited by foreign powers. The Elamites, fierce rivals from the Iranian plateau, invaded Babylonia around 1155 BCE under their king Shutruk-Nikunti. They captured Babylon, plundered its temples, and carried off many treasures, including the stele of Hammurabi's code, which they transported to their capital at Susa. This act was not only material theft but also symbolic domination. The removal of Hammurabi's laws represented the humiliation of Babylon's intellectual and legal legacy. The Elamite victory ended Kassite rule completely, and Babylon once again found itself stripped of its former glory. However, the Elamite occupation was short-lived. Around 1125 BCE, a new leader emerged to restore some measure of Babylonian independence, Nebuchadnezzar I, founder of the Second Isin dynasty. A fierce and capable ruler, Nebuchadnezzar launched a counteroffensive against Elam, defeating its armies and recovering the stolen statue of Marduk, Babylon's chief god. His triumph was celebrated as a divine victory, symbolizing the restoration of order and faith. Religious hymns and royal inscriptions from his reign speak of the god Marduk's return and the renewal of Babylon's covenant with the divine. For a brief moment, Babylon once again stood proud, its people united under a revitalized sense of destiny. Despite this revival, Nebuchadnezzar's success could not reverse deeper structural problems. The economy was weakened by years of war, irrigation systems had decayed, and many farmlands lay abandoned. Trade routes that had once connected Babylon to Syria, Anatolia, and the Persian Gulf were disrupted by migrating peoples. Among the most significant of these groups were the Arameans, nomadic tribes from the west who began to settle across Mesopotamia. Their movements destabilized existing political boundaries and further eroded centralized control. The Arameans, along with the Chaldeans who migrated into southern Babylonia, would profoundly influence the region's future political landscape. Throughout the 11th and 10th centuries BCE, Babylon's rulers were often local dynasts or tribal leaders who controlled only parts of the former kingdom. Assyria, to the north, began to reassert its dominance during this time. Kings such as Ashur-dan II launched campaigns that extended Assyrian influence deep into Babylonian territory. Yet even when Babylon fell under Assyrian pressure, it was never fully assimilated. The Assyrians, despite their military superiority, regarded Babylon with a mixture of respect and fear, as the sacred city of the gods, the birthplace of civilization. To conquer Babylon was one thing, to destroy it was another, for that would mean defying the divine order of Mesopotamia itself. Culturally, this so-called Dark Age was not entirely dark. Babylonian scribes continued to preserve ancient texts, religious rituals, and astronomical observations. The temples of Marduk, Nabu, and Ishtar remained centers of learning. Even when political power fragmented, Babylon's priests and scholars maintained the intellectual traditions that had shaped Mesopotamian thought for centuries. This continuity of knowledge would later enable Babylon's remarkable resurgence under the Neo-Babylonian Empire. By the end of the 10th century BCE, Babylon was a city weary from centuries of conflict yet unbroken in spirit. Its political influence had waned, and much of Mesopotamia was now under Assyrian domination. But within the city's walls, the flame of civilization still burned. The resilience of its culture, faith, and people ensured that Babylon would not vanish into history. Instead, it waited, patient and enduring, for the next great revival that would once again make it the center of the ancient world. As the first millennium BCE dawned, the power balance in Mesopotamia began to shift once again. While Babylon languished in a period of political weakness and regional fragmentation, its northern neighbor Assyria was rising with unprecedented vigor. The Neo-Assyrian Empire, which emerged around 900 BCE, would become the most formidable power the ancient Near East had ever seen. Babylon, though diminished and often subjugated, remained at the heart of Mesopotamian civilization. Its spiritual prestige, intellectual heritage, and strategic position ensured that no Assyrian king could ignore it. Yet this relationship between the two great cities of the Tigris and Euphrates was never peaceful. It oscillated between uneasy alliance and violent confrontation, admiration and destruction. By the time of Ashur-dan II and Adad-nirari II, Assyria had begun to reorganize itself into a centralized, militarized state. Its kings transformed seasonal campaigns into permanent conquest. With iron weapons, professional armies, and efficient administration, the Assyrians set out to dominate the entire Near East. Babylon, located directly to the south, was both a target and a temptation, rich in culture, religious prestige, and agricultural wealth. Assyrian kings, however, approached Babylon with caution. To the Mesopotamian mind, Babylon was the navel of the world, the seat of Marduk, king of the gods. Any ruler who desecrated the city risked divine wrath. Therefore, the early Neo-Assyrian kings adopted a policy of controlled influence. Rather than immediate conquest, they sought to install friendly rulers, collect tribute, and ensure that Babylon remained stable under Assyrian supervision. This delicate balance was maintained through much of the 9th century BCE, but the situation changed dramatically under Tiglath-Pileser III, one of the most transformative rulers in Assyrian history. He reorganized the empire into provinces governed by Assyrian officials, imposed direct taxation, and restructured the military into a disciplined standing force. For the first time, Assyria began to treat Babylon not as an equal but as a vassal state. While Assyria expanded, Babylon suffered from internal strife. The land was divided among powerful tribal groups, most notably the Chaldeans in the south and the Arameans scattered along the Euphrates. These groups alternately rebelled against and cooperated with Assyria, depending on political opportunity. Babylon's native dynasties were short-lived, often overthrown by tribal leaders claiming royal legitimacy. The resulting instability made Babylon vulnerable to foreign manipulation. Tiglath-Pileser III exploited this weakness by intervening in Babylonian succession disputes. In 729 BCE, after defeating a rebellious Chaldean prince named Ukinzer, he crowned himself king of Babylon, uniting the thrones of Assyria and Babylonia. This dual kingship was unprecedented. It symbolized both the dominance of Assyria and its recognition of Babylon's sacred status. To rule Babylon was not simply a political act, it was a divine duty, legitimized by the god Marduk himself. However, this unity was fragile. The Assyrian and Babylonian elites mistrusted one another. While Assyrians viewed Babylonians as proud but decadent, the Babylonians saw Assyrians as brutal usurpers lacking cultural refinement. This tension would repeatedly explode into rebellion throughout the next century. After Tiglath-Pileser's death, his successors faced constant unrest. Shalmaneser V and Sargon II both struggled to maintain control over Babylon. The Chaldeans, led by ambitious leaders such as Marduk-apla-iddina II, rallied southern tribes in resistance. Marduk-apla-iddina seized Babylon's throne twice, first around 721 BCE and again briefly in 703 BCE, with support from Elam, Assyria's old enemy to the east. For over 2 decades, Babylon became the center of anti-Assyrian resistance. The Assyrians responded with relentless campaigns. Sargon II eventually captured Babylon, but he was killed in battle soon after, a fate many Babylonians interpreted as divine punishment for his aggression. His son, Sennacherib, inherited both the throne and the Babylonian problem, and he would handle it with unprecedented brutality. After years of rebellion, Sennacherib lost patience. In 689 BCE, following yet another uprising led by Babylonian nationalists, he ordered the complete destruction of the city. His inscriptions boast of flooding Babylon with water from the Euphrates, turning it into a desolate ruin. Temples were looted, walls demolished, and the statue of Marduk carried away. This act shocked the ancient world. To destroy Babylon, the sacred city of the gods, was viewed as sacrilege even among Assyrians. Sennacherib justified his actions by claiming that Marduk himself had turned against his people. But in the eyes of history, the destruction of Babylon became the symbol of Assyria's arrogance and impiety. Sennacherib's son, Esarhaddon, recognized the political and spiritual damage his father had caused. In an extraordinary gesture, he undertook the rebuilding of Babylon. Temples were restored, the statue of Marduk returned, and religious festivals resumed. Esarhaddon declared that his father's actions had been impious and that the gods demanded Babylon's renewal. His inscriptions describe the reconstruction as an act of piety and reconciliation, meant to restore harmony between Assyria and the divine world. Esarhaddon's policy was continued by his son, Ashurbanipal, the last great king of Assyria. Under him, Babylon enjoyed a period of relative peace and prosperity. The city's libraries and temples flourished once again. Ashurbanipal, an educated monarch who could read and write Akkadian and Sumerian, valued Babylonian scholarship deeply. He collected vast numbers of cuneiform tablets, preserving ancient texts in both Nineveh and Babylon. Ironically, the very empire that had once burned Babylon now became the guardian of its intellectual heritage. Despite these gestures of goodwill, the relationship between Assyria and Babylon remained uneasy. The Chaldeans and Arameans never fully accepted Assyrian domination. In the late 7th century BCE, as Assyria began to weaken from internal strife and overextension, Babylon once again became the rallying point for resistance. A new Chaldean leader, Nabopolassar, rose to power in 626 BCE. Capitalizing on Assyria's decline, he declared Babylon's independence and launched a series of campaigns to drive the Assyrians from southern Mesopotamia. His forces allied with the Medes, a rising power from the Iranian plateau, to besiege and eventually destroy the Assyrian heartland. By 612 BCE, the Assyrian capital of Nineveh fell, a catastrophic event that marked the end of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. For the first time in nearly 5 centuries, Babylon stood free from foreign control. The Chaldean dynasty founded by Nabopolassar would soon usher in the era of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, one of the most brilliant and celebrated periods in ancient Near Eastern history. The century of Assyrian rule left a complex legacy. On one hand, it brought devastation, forced migrations, and the near annihilation of Babylonian independence. On the other, it preserved Babylonian knowledge, architecture, and religious tradition through careful restoration and documentation. The Assyrians, for all their brutality, recognized that Babylon represented something eternal, the cultural soul of Mesopotamia. The story of Babylon under Assyrian domination is thus one of endurance and rebirth. Time and again, the city was conquered, looted, or even destroyed, yet each time it rose again. Its survival was not due to military strength, but to the enduring power of its culture, and its idea, that civilization itself began and must continue in Babylon. When the dust of Nineveh settled and Assyria lay in ruins, it was Babylon, the city once drowned by Sennacherib, that rose from the ashes to inherit the world. When the Assyrian Empire finally collapsed in 612 BCE, the world that had been dominated for centuries by Assyrian kings suddenly fell silent. The once mighty city of Nineveh lay in ruins, its palaces burned and its libraries plundered. Out of that silence rose a new power, Babylon, rejuvenated under the leadership of a Chaldean dynasty that would restore the city's grandeur and redefine its place in history. This period, known as the Neo-Babylonian Empire, marked Babylon's last and greatest flowering before its final fall. At its center stood Nebuchadnezzar II, whose name would echo across millennia as the architect of Babylon's golden age. The founder of this new empire was Nabopolassar, a Chaldean chieftain from the marshlands of southern Mesopotamia. For centuries, the Chaldeans had been regarded by Assyrians as semi-barbaric tribes, but Nabopolassar proved himself a skilled diplomat and strategist. When Assyria weakened after the death of Ashurbanipal, Nabopolassar seized the opportunity. In 626 BCE, he declared Babylon's independence and began systematically liberating southern Mesopotamia from Assyrian control. Nabopolassar's most decisive move came in 614 BCE, when he formed an alliance with Cyaxares, the king of the Medes, who ruled over much of modern Iran. Together, their armies besieged and destroyed Nineveh in 612 BCE, ending Assyria's long reign of terror. The victory transformed Babylon into the new imperial capital of the Near East. Nabopolassar spent the remaining years of his reign consolidating power, securing trade routes, and rebuilding the city's infrastructure, preparing the way for his son, Nebuchadnezzar II. When Nebuchadnezzar II ascended the throne in 605 BCE, he was already a seasoned commander. That same year, he achieved a decisive victory over the Egyptians at the Battle of Carchemish, securing control of Syria and the Levant, the very regions that Assyria had once ruled. This victory established Babylon as the dominant power from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea. Nebuchadnezzar's military campaigns were both ambitious and relentless. Over the next 2 decades, he subdued rebellious states across the Levant, including Judah, Tyre, and Phoenicia. His siege of Jerusalem in 597 BCE and again in 587 BCE led to the destruction of the First Temple and the Babylonian exile of the Jewish people, one of the most significant events in biblical history. From a purely historical perspective, these actions reflected Nebuchadnezzar's determination to maintain absolute control over his empire's western frontiers, which were crucial for trade and defense. Though often remembered in Judeo-Christian tradition as a tyrant, Nebuchadnezzar was in many ways a visionary ruler, a monarch who combined military might with an unparalleled passion for architecture, administration, and cultural revival. Under Nebuchadnezzar II, Babylon was transformed into the most magnificent city of the ancient world. Located on the banks of the Euphrates River, the city covered nearly 2,500 acres and was enclosed by massive double walls that, according to ancient accounts, stretched for over 16 kilometers in circumference. Herodotus later described the walls as so wide that chariots could pass one another atop them, perhaps an exaggeration, but symbolic of their grandeur. At the heart of the city stood the Ishtar Gate, an architectural masterpiece adorned with deep blue glazed bricks and reliefs of lions, bulls, and dragons, symbols of the gods Ishtar, Adad, and Marduk. The processional way, paved with limestone and decorated with flower motifs, led through this gate to the temple of Marduk, the Asagila, and the towering Etemenanki ziggurat, which many scholars believe inspired later biblical references to the Tower of Babel. Nebuchadnezzar's inscriptions reveal his pride in these achievements. "I have built Babylon, the holy city, the glory of the great gods, more splendid than before, and have raised its head to the heavens." His construction projects extended beyond Babylon itself. He fortified Borsippa, Sippar, and Uruk, restored ancient temples, and built canals and irrigation systems that revitalized agriculture throughout Mesopotamia. Babylon became not only a political capital but also a religious and economic metropolis, drawing merchants, scholars, and artisans from across the empire. Among Nebuchadnezzar's most enduring legends is the creation of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Ancient writers described them as a series of terraced gardens with lush vegetation cascading from arched balconies, an artificial mountain built in the heart of the desert. According to later accounts, Nebuchadnezzar built the gardens for his wife, Amytis of Media, who missed the green hills of her homeland. Whether these gardens truly existed in Babylon remains debated among historians and archaeologists. Some suggest they may have been located in Nineveh, misattributed to Nebuchadnezzar by later Greek authors. Yet, even if mythic, the story of the Hanging Gardens captures the essence of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, the union of engineering genius and aesthetic splendor. The Neo-Babylonian Empire was not sustained by conquest alone, it was maintained by an efficient bureaucracy. Nebuchadnezzar inherited and expanded the administrative systems of earlier Mesopotamian states. His empire was divided into provinces governed by local officials responsible for tax collection, law enforcement, and military conscription. A network of canals facilitated transport and irrigation, making southern Mesopotamia one of the most fertile regions of the ancient world. Trade flourished under Babylonian rule. Caravans brought cedar wood from Lebanon, copper from Arabia, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, and spices from India. Babylon itself became a cosmopolitan hub, where Aramaic, Akkadian, and Sumerian languages mingled. The city's scribes, priests, and astronomers preserved ancient knowledge while making new advancements in mathematics, astronomy, and architecture. The Babylonian calendar, based on precise lunar observations, influenced later Greek and Roman timekeeping. Astronomers at the Asagla temple recorded planetary movements and eclipses with remarkable accuracy, laying the foundation for future scientific study. Religion remained the cornerstone of Babylonian life. Marduk, the city's patron deity, was revered as the supreme god of the cosmos. The annual New Year festival, Akitu, symbolized the renewal of cosmic order, during which the king humbled himself before Marduk's statue, reaffirming his legitimacy as ruler. Nebuchadnezzar's devotion to Marduk was sincere and politically astute. By restoring temples and reviving ancient rituals, he linked his reign to the divine heritage of earlier Mesopotamian kings. This religious continuity gave the Neo-Babylonian Empire a sense of sacred destiny, the idea that Babylon was not merely a city, but the center of the universe ordained by the gods. Culturally, Babylon became a beacon of art and scholarship. Cuneiform tablets from this era reveal advancements in law, literature, and science. The Epic of Gilgamesh continued to be copied and studied, while hymns, prayers, and omen texts circulated widely among scribal schools. In many ways, Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon served as the final flowering of a civilization that had begun over 2,000 years earlier in Sumer. Nebuchadnezzar reigned for 43 years, from 605 to 562 BCE, one of the longest and most stable reigns in Mesopotamian history. In his later years, he focused less on warfare and more on governance, temple restoration, and monumental architecture. However, after his death, the empire began to show signs of decline. His successors lacked his vision and authority. Court intrigues, short reigns, and power struggles weakened central control. Despite its relatively short duration, the Neo-Babylonian Empire left an indelible mark on human civilization. It preserved and expanded upon the cultural, architectural, and scientific achievements of earlier Mesopotamian societies. The image of Babylon, a city of dazzling splendor, towering ziggurats, and radiant palaces, became embedded in later Greek, Persian, and biblical imaginations as both a symbol of divine majesty and human pride. When Cyrus the Great of Persia eventually conquered Babylon in 539 BCE, he did not destroy it, he honored it. This was a testament to the enduring reverence that even conquerors felt for the city that Nebuchadnezzar had built. For centuries afterward, Babylon remained a center of learning and religion, the city that had once again risen to rule the world. Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon represented the zenith of Mesopotamian civilization, the culmination of millennia of urban culture, science, and religious thought. Though the empire would soon fall, its memory endured, inspiring legends that stretched from the Bible to Greek historiography, and eventually, to the collective imagination of humanity.